Well, what is the biggest threat to the United States of America? Different people have different ideas on that. Me personally, if you asked me, I'd tell you it's the United States government, namely the FBI. But some say China. I can't say they're wrong. I wonder what Carol Roth says. Oh, here it is. Quote, the biggest threat, bar none, to U.S. growth has been and remains the U.S. government policy and U.S. government spending. And it's awfully hard to tell Carol she's wrong about that, especially given everything we're seeing today. Sorry, I'm in a sour mood about all this. Joining me now, my friend Carol Roth, author of so many great books, including the one You Will Own Nothing, which apparently you most definitely will at some point in time, given this level of government spending. Hey, Carol, why is U.S. government policy bad?
Well, I'm not going to be the one to put you in a better mood, Jesse, so apologies for that in advance. But basically, they have racked up so much debt as well as deficits that at this point are wartime level deficits at a time when we're supposed to be having quote unquote growth, that it's put us in a really terrible fiscal position. We have a balance sheet that looks like that of an emerging market about to have a sovereign debt crisis. The only reason it hasn't happened so far is that we're the world reserve currency, but certainly many countries are trying to move away from that. As I said, we have these crazy deficit levels. And at the end of the day, we put ourselves into a position where we're now spending more to service the interest on our debt than we are for defense spending. So it's difficult for us to be a strong country and have the cards and make the deals that we want to when we have this really terrible fiscal position. And it's created lots of issues and choices and trade-offs, all of which end up, in the end, screwing the American consumer.
Carol, describe this sovereign debt crisis, because as you said, we've been able to we've been able to rack up this amount of debt, spend at this level because we are the world's reserve currency. When you're trading your goods and services, you can always rely on the US dollar, of course. But what does a debt crisis look like if they decide they're done with all that and they're going to go to something like gold?
Well, I think that the first thing that probably happens is we get a dysfunction in the treasury markets where everything go crazy and you start to see rates spiking. And the most likely thing that's going to happen is that the Fed and the government aren't going to want to go immediately into a crisis. So they're going to do what they need to do to stop the bleeding. And what does that usually look like? Well, that usually looks like something we saw quantitative easing with the Fed buying lots of securities, a certain amount of securities to keep down interest rates and to help the situation out because there are no other buyers for the debt. But it could come in a different package. There's something called yield curve control, which is a kind of the same thing. But instead of having a defined program like QE, where they say we're going to buy $1 trillion worth of bonds, they say we're going to buy whatever it takes in order to keep the yield below a certain amount, or something that approximates that under some other special pretty packaging. And as we've seen before, what does that do? It ends up transferring wealth to the asset holders. It ends up creating inflation for the everyday consumer. It drives non-merit-based inequality, and that continues on until everybody says, okay, this is crazy, and we need to have some other sort of ordering of our financial order.
Carol, one thing that drives me so insane about this whole thing, it makes me want to choke somebody, is how obvious and inevitable all this is. It's not a left or right or conservative or Democrat or libertarian. It's simple math. You can't run up these numbers. It's obvious. Even the morons in Washington, D.C. know what you say is true, yet no one wants to stop it. Even the American voter, honestly. Yeah, they want to stop transing mice, but they don't want to actually make significant government cuts to anything, and that's why we are where we are.
Yeah, well, the challenge is that they want to do it at the macro level. That way they know we need to stop spending. But when it comes down to the micro level and it threatens their own, specific pet project or the dollars that they are getting personally, then it becomes personal and it needs to shift. And this is just basic human nature, which is why this is, as you said, all very predictable. And the larger the government gets, the more likely this is to happen. So that's really what we're up against. Even with spending cuts, though, Jesse, we have to do this in a way that's very careful because we have the debt to GDP that we do and the deficit to GDP. Part of the issue that we have is that we've been taking in very large amounts of revenue, and that's been based on government spending, propping up our GDP and generating some additional revenue. It's been propping up our stock market and generating revenue from that. If that stops, if we cut spending too fast, as you and I have discussed before, what could end up happening is that we get a decrease in revenue, and these are the government quote unquote revenue, the tax revenue. And we saw that back in, I think it was the third quarter of 2022. If we get a recession, if we have prolonged dips in the stock market, we're talking it could be $500 billion, $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion or more that we're no longer taking in, and it really ends up exploding that deficit. That's what's happened, before when we've seen the stock market go down, as well as in previous recessions. So, you don't want to be in a no good deed goes unpunished situation either. So they have to be very careful in how they phase out that financing, at the same time finding ways to amplify growth, so that you get that kick up in the GDP. Because if you do it in a way that brings down the GDP, then again, we end up in this vicious cycle, which takes us back into that potential for a debt spiral.
Carol, how does China come into play here? Obviously, they're going to be a player of some kind because globally you can't ignore them. How does China, our policy with China, how does it affect any of this?
Oh, it affects all kinds of things, including the fact that the Chinese own all kinds of assets, including treasuries, the stock market, and whatnot. So, for the amount of leverage that we think we have over China, they also have leverage on the other side. And if we get into a match with them, because they think in hundreds of years, and we have a new president every 4 or 8 years, as well as a shift over of Congress every 2 years. So it's very difficult to have a long-term strategy, and so they're able to wait out dips and shifts and changes in a different way than we are. So I would imagine, to the extent that we cannot get China to come to the table and do something side by side, that's actually very bad for us. And I know we all hate China, and we all, understand the issues with communism and whatnot, but this is the situation that we're in now. And to our own benefit, we need to be able to find a way to figure out where their points are, where we meet in the middle, and be able to extract ourselves and build up the capabilities and, right our financial ship and do all of these things first before we can fully cut them off, because otherwise it's going to end up being to our own detriment. And as I wrote about in You Will Own Nothing, it could actually end up in war. And when you've had previous massive changes in the global financial order before, it's always been preceded by war. So this is a very tenuous situation. The Biden administration left the Trump administration a mess. They don't have a lot of options here. And that's why, we're seeing, as they're trying to do things, that it's been pretty painful.
When goods stop crossing borders, armies will. That's an old saying. I don't know who said it, but I'll take credit for it. I guess I said it. Well, I'm going to let you go now, Carol. Goodbye. Thank you. I'm so sad. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.